Shortly after the events of Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, the United States government began an official policy that became known as Japanese internment. Under the internment policy, which was in effect from 1942 until 1945, Japanese immigrants and American citizens of Japanese heritage were forcefully removed from their homes and forced to relocate to internment camps throughout the United States. The process of Japanese internment began as a response to the anger, aggression, discrimination, and racism that was being displayed towards Japanese Americans and Japanese immigrants living in the United States after Pearl Harbor. In 1942, there were two groups of Japanese citizens living here in the United States. The first group, which were known as the Issei, were immigrants who were born in Japan but who had recently immigrated to the United States leading up to World War II. And so this group accounted for roughly 30,000 of the people who were forced into the internment camps. The second group, which was the larger group and the group that became the focus of protests to Japanese internment, were the Nisei, which were second and third generation American citizens whose families had come from Japan, but who had been born here in the United States and were American citizens in 1942. And so this group was roughly 2 or 3 times as large as the Issei and accounted for roughly 80 to 90,000 people who were ultimately impacted by the internment process. The process of Japanese internment began shortly after Pearl Harbor when the United States government began to restrict the rights of Japanese Americans. Japanese Americans and Japanese immigrants were forced to turn over certain pieces of property that they might have owned that were deemed as potentially threatening. So things like shortwave radios that could allow Japanese Americans or Japanese immigrants to communicate with other Japanese immigrants or citizens, or Japanese soldiers were confiscated. Things like cameras and binoculars, which could be used to take pictures of military bases or things like that, that could be used to, potentially help the Japanese against us or be used to sabotage our war effort, were restricted. And then ultimately firearms and weapons were confiscated so that any Japanese living in the United States, could not have access to weapons that they might be able to use in an attack against us. And so this was the first phase of the internment process. But where it really took off was with Executive Order 9066, which was issued by President Franklin Roosevelt in February 1942. Under this executive order, FDR granted the Secretary of War the authority to create what became known as military areas throughout the United States. And once an area was declared as a military area, that area was under the control of the United States Army, and their authority overrode the authority and the laws of state and local government. And so what began to happen is that military areas were established all along the west coast of the United States, in San Francisco, in Los Angeles, in the state of Washington, where there were a large number of Japanese immigrants and Japanese American populations. These areas were established, and any Japanese immigrant or American who was 1/16 Japanese in their heritage was ordered by the United States military to leave their home. And so under these orders, roughly 100,000 Japanese Americans were forced out of their homes. They lost their businesses, they lost their property, they lost their jobs, and they were forced to relocate to an internment camp like you see down here in the picture in the right-hand corner of the slide. Once you were ordered to internment camp, you were only allowed to take some basic items that you could carry with you. So most people lost their most essential belongings. Again, they would lose their homes, and all they were able to take was what they could carry in a suitcase. So, you know, a personal item or two, some clothing, and you know, that was all you got to take as you were relocated to one of the 10 camps throughout the United States. So, um, in most cases, your location, the camp you were sent to, was based on a number of factors. If you were a recent immigrant or an American of Japanese descent who had a criminal record or things like that, you were sent to the more high security camps where you could be more closely monitored and secured, while other Americans were sent to other camps. But ultimately, through these actions, over 80,000 American citizens lost some of their most basic civil rights, including the First Amendment protections of freedom of speech and freedom of press, the right to peaceably assemble and petition the government for redress of grievances, were all violated. Any Japanese Americans who had their guns taken from them had their Second Amendment right violated. And all of the victims of internment had their Fifth Amendment rights, which include the right to a trial by jury and the right to be considered innocent until proven guilty in a court of law, were violated. And so these actions became very controversial as they became more and more prevalent throughout the United States. The criticism and the controversy behind these actions led to two important legal challenges that were brought through the American court system. The first of these challenges was a case that became known as Korematsu versus the United States, which was decided by the U.S. Supreme Court in 1944. In this case, Fred Korematsu, who was an American citizen of Japanese descent, refused to leave his home and relocate to his assigned internment camp, and he was arrested. Korematsu challenged his arrest through the American court system, and when his case reached the Supreme Court, he argued that forcing him to leave his home without having been charged and convicted of a crime was a violation of his Fifth Amendment rights to a trial. And in this case, the Supreme Court ultimately ruled that what the United States Army was doing by creating military areas and forcing people to move out of them was actually legal. And they said that Executive Order 9066 and what was being done was a lawful use of the president's war powers based on the United States Constitution. And since the United States was officially at war, having declared war on Japan, this action was lawful. The second case was a case called Ex parte Endo, which was also heard in 1944 and was decided on the same day as Korematsu versus the United States. In this case, the Supreme Court ruled that the detention and incarceration of citizens who had not broken the law or who had not been given a trial was unconstitutional and was a violation of the rights of American citizens. And so through these two decisions, it was ultimately unclear as to what the government was allowed to do in terms of internment and what it was not allowed to do. While they could create military areas and force people to move out of them, they could not actually hold you anywhere and detain you in an internment camp without giving you a trial and proving your guilt or that you were a threat to the war effort. So ultimately, these two cases became important because they led to the end of the internment policy and the release of Japanese immigrants and Americans of Japanese descent who had been interned. But these two decisions, through their unclarity or through their confusion, didn't really address the issue. Neither one of the cases addressed the issues of racism and discrimination, and the fact that what was being done was only being done to people of Japanese descent, and as a result, these became two of the more controversial decisions in American legal history. Ultimately, the events of internment were attempted to be addressed, but that didn't occur until 1988 when President Ronald Reagan signed into law the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, which provided $20,000 to all surviving internees. So any Japanese American who was still alive in 1988 was given $20,000 as a payment or as reparations for their treatment during the internment process. And ultimately in 1998, Fred Korematsu was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom by U.S. President Bill Clinton for his efforts to raise awareness about Japanese internment and for his treatment and his actions as a civil rights leader. So, again, Japanese internment, one of the most controversial parts of American history, and we can see that through these efforts to, repair the damage that was done to Japanese Americans. Despite all of the racism, discrimination, and activity that was going on surrounding Japanese internment, Japanese Americans made significant contributions to the U.S. war effort in World War II. The most significant of these was the 442nd Regimental Combat Unit, which was deployed in the European theater. This group included, or was a segregated group of soldiers that was made up of 14,000 Japanese Americans who had volunteered to serve the country despite Japanese internment and everything that they had gone through. This group took part in two of the most important events in the European theater. In the first one, they secured the Vosges Mountains in Italy, which became a strategic point, and accomplished a mission that several other regiments of soldiers had been unable to accomplish. And then they also were responsible for rescuing 211 soldiers who had become known as the Lost Battalion after they had been trapped in France. But to liberate and rescue those 211 soldiers, over 800 Japanese Americans lost their lives in the rescue efforts. And ultimately, the 442nd became the most decorated unit of World War II, earning over 18,000 medals for their bravery. So things like Purple Hearts, the Medal of Honor, and commendations for other actions that they took throughout the war. Came to recognize this group and what they accomplished for our country in World War II. And in addition to them, there were a number of other Japanese Americans and Japanese immigrants who enlisted and served as interpreters and translators, helping to decode messages that had been intercepted between Japanese military units in the Pacific theater. So, despite the internment process and the hysteria that the country went through, Japanese Americans made a major contribution to the U.S. war effort in World War II.